This is a lecture on the United States Constitution. It's taking place at the campus of the Center for Advanced Legal Studies in Houston, Texas. My name is Tom Swanson. Understanding the Constitution is almost critical if you really want to be an informed voter, understand what's happening to you out there, interact with government agencies. The more you know about the Constitution, the better off you are. You know, the first question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this Constitution? Well, basically, a good starting point is the beginning of the age of exploration around the 1300s. At this point in time, you had Western Europeans began the process of looking for trade routes to engage in commerce in different parts of the world. These expeditions oftentimes were sponsored by nation states. Three of the biggest were Spain, France, and Great Britain. And after a while, when these trade routes were established and so forth, there were new lands discovered, and we entered into the age of imperialism. Simply, that means a situation where one country exploits the lands and peoples of another country. And so you had this competition going on between the European powers, of which Great Britain, France, and Spain were the major players. And so when you look at the North American continent, beginning around the 1600s, you start to see inroads by these powers. With Great Britain, you had territory along the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, of course, up into Canada. The French had part of Canada, and after a time, part of the Louisiana territory, as they called it. In Spain, as far as along the same area, it had Florida and what was called the Floridas, which ran along the Gulf of Mexico. And so, at any rate, you had these powers competing, and they were establishing these territories. So you have this era where there is the beginning of territories supervised, controlled by these powers. Now, these places initially were pretty much a wilderness. So you have people beginning to come here from Europe in the 1600s. And so the question becomes, why? Why go to this wilderness, unfamiliar world where you risked life and limb? Well, there were a number of reasons that this happened, but for one thing is that once a territory was established, let's say by Great Britain, this was a great way to obtain additional resources. You would find out what the resources were, whether it be lumber, whether it be precious metals or whatever. And as time went on, you would have people wanting to come there for various reasons. And the government of Great Britain, for example, they found the colonies, the American colonies, as a place to offload problems. And for example, Great Britain had big time problems with religious conflict and with the Protestant Reformation and so forth. And so what happened was, if you had a particular religious sect and that sect was becoming a problem, well, the king could grant them land in the New World of North America. And so basically you had the king that was granting large tracts of land to different parties as a way of solving problems, getting these political problems out of the way. Now you also had people who came over to the colonies because they really didn't fit in the normal scheme of things in Europe. For example, a person who was illegitimate, and this person was devalued. They were disabled under the law. They couldn't inherit and things like this. Well, they could go to this new world. They could change their name if they wanted. They could create a new identity, or they could just, people wouldn't know who they were. They wouldn't know their family background and so forth. So people who didn't fit in for one reason or the other, including malcontents, weirdos, people who were just dissatisfied with their lot in the European area. But in final analysis, as time went on, the reason people came was for land. See, so much of the land was tied up in Europe and by the nobility. And so the idea was nobility was exemplified by land holdings. So you can imagine what it was like to hear that you could go to this new territory and own your own land. This was huge. In other words, okay, now I own my own land, so am I like the royalty, you see? So land ownership was a huge thing. It was power, it was sustenance, it was influence. And so people began to just come over in droves. How bad did they want to come over to these 13 colonies along the Atlantic Ocean? Pretty badly. Some of them would actually sign what were called contracts of indenture, in which they would agree for the cost of the passage over to the colonies. They would agree to be in a condition of servitude until they had worked off the cost of their passage. Imagine that, somebody wanting to get somewhere that badly, and what the allure of land was for the people back then. Now, the Great Britain had an advantage, I believe, in the sense that at the time it was probably the freest country in the world. It had established, beginning with the Magna Carta in 1215, a series of reforms that ultimately made the people freer, even though there was still a monarchy. You had in the 1620s the Petition of Right, which was the idea was to grant greater rights to people. You had a civil war in the 1640s, and it was over the power of the king versus the power of the people in the parliament, and their rights under the Petition of Right. And there was a civil war in England, and as a result of the Civil War, King Charles was defeated in the rebellion and ultimately beheaded. Great Britain went without a monarch for about 12 years and then finally reestablished the monarchy. However, in the 1680s, the English adopted a Bill of Rights that gave much greater freedom to the people. And hence, here you have now a nation that is the freest nation in the world. And of course, that filtered, to the colonies as well. Nevertheless, there were things that the Great Britain didn't count on happening. The series of unfortunate events. One thing was that as time went on, the colonists, of course, they raised families, and you had generation after generation of people being born in the colonies. And they lived different lives than the people back in Great Britain. And eventually, they ceased being European and started becoming something else. They were different. They had to deal with the wilderness. They had to deal with different kinds of challenges, wild animals, things of this nature, the illnesses that may have been indigenous there. So after a while, they simply became different. This meant that they were used to being more self-reliant, less regulated, this sort of thing. So the evolution of the people was one factor. Another factor was that Great Britain had a problem, and that is people over there were getting sick and tired of paying high taxes. They were at their limit. They did not want to be taxed anymore. And of course, you know, governments always need money, and they never get enough. And so there was a brainstorming of sorts about how do we get more revenue without causing a rebellion amongst our people. The answer was, hey, how about those colonies across the Atlantic Ocean? I mean, they're getting the benefit of the protection of the crown. They need to pay. They need to pay their fair share. Okay? And so there began the process of new taxes being imposed on the colonial Americans. And, you know, the taxes were oftentimes ill-advised. Initially, there was the Stamp Act, where basically, imagine if you went to the grocery store and, you know, you purchased your items, and you get to the cashier, and the cashier says, oh, by the way, you have to pay $10 for the receipt. And you say, $10? I don't want the receipt. Sorry about that. You've got to take the receipt and you've got to pay $10 for it. So this was basically what the Stamp Act was like. Unless it was a personal letter, a document had to have a tax stamp on it. And some of the amounts were very high for the time. On deeds and things like this, it might be $300. You know, so this started a process. It started a process of the colonial Americans getting aggravated. They started to sit there and think, why are we being treated like this? We don't like it. So eventually, the Stamp Act was eliminated, and they came up with the tea tax. And so the colonials were probably even madder about that. In other words, you can't even have a cup of tea without the king putting his hand in your pocket. So it began to create civil disobedience. And there began to be more and more friction between the colonial Americans and the forces and authority of Great Britain. And there began to be incidents of confrontation between young colonial men and young British soldiers. It evolved and evolved. And although many of them involved young men, there were conventional, well-to-do elites that also had issues with Great Britain. One thing was that they felt they were taken advantage of when they shipped their goods, to Great Britain, and the system there of charging them excessively for goods ordered versus paying them less for the goods that they submitted. In other words, a system existed that the elites became somewhat resentful of. Okay. So in time, the escalation began to be greater and greater. The government of Great Britain realized that it was going to have to clamp down. This created more conflict. And by 1775, there was serious conflict beginning. And hence, the beginning of what we call the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution from the colonial side was fought by primarily what they called, the local militias. Each colony had a militia in which all men between a certain age would have to go for drill and be prepared in case there were attacks and that sort of thing. For example, the Virginia militia, probably one of the most effective, had been led by George Washington. He had been in involved in the French and Indian War. So he had actually been in combat and that sort of thing. And so he was a high-profile individual. But these militias, varied in quality, and they were only to serve for specific periods. However, once the hostilities began, the colonies did not have a professional military. So they tried to establish one, the Continental Army, and they, tried to get people into trained soldiers and so forth. But they were no match, absolutely no match for Great Britain. Great Britain had an incredibly effective military and very modern. And what they did not count on was they did not count on that the American colonials were going to stretch this thing out. They realized that they couldn't confront Britain head on, and so they began what's often called a Fabian War. And this Fabian War meant that they found situations where the enemy, British soldiers or others that they paid to fight, mercenaries, they would pick their spots and then defeat them locally, take their arms, clothing, food, things like this to continue sustaining them. And they drug out the war and slowly began to become more effective. The Continental Army became better. It got larger. The militia, got better, and continued to hang in there, to continue to fight the British. By 1783, some 8 years after these hostilities had begun, Britain had had enough. Reluctantly, they agreed to grant independence to the American colonies. And so the 13 colonies became a nation guided by a document called the Articles of Confederation. That is to say that the states were independent, sovereign governments, but they were loosely allied through this document called the Articles of Confederation. When we come back, we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation and what it led to.